Hello, everyone. Great to see you for this session at the Frontier Science House, which is focusing on the Frontiers Planet Prize and the advancements of planetary boundary science through the world's largest scientific prize in the world today to promote scientific advancements on planetary boundaries. My name is Johan Rockström. I'm a professor in Earth System Science and the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, but also privileged to be the chair of the jury of 100 scholars around the world that are part of the international assessment of all the science that then leads to both national and international champions for this work. And I'm particularly privileged to have with me here on stage 3 international champions through the years, who will be giving updates to you on the winning contributions. So Arunima Malik, professor at the University of Sydney, with a winning research article, and you'll be thematically walking us through the polarization, equalization trends in international trade and sustainable development goals, which was published in Nature Sustainability. And then we have Sara Kalantari, professor in environmental science at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, on contributions of prioritized urban nature-based solutions, allocation to carbon neutrality, which was a great paper in Nature Climate Change. And then to my right here, Zia Mehrabi, assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, founder Better Planet Laboratory, with work on joint environmental and social benefits from diversified agriculture. And I can tell you that we had a great challenge as a jury of academics to assess all the contributions coming from National Academy of Sciences, international science organizations around the world. These are real champions, because that was it was almost like a planetary Olympic game of science, and here you have the gold medalists. So it's a privilege for me to be facilitating this panel with you by my side. I've been asked to start, though, and so bear with me a few minutes to give you a bit of a scientific rundown on what's the framing for the Frontiers Planet Prize, the planetary boundary science behind this whole initiative. So fundamentally, I think it's a good reminder why it's so urgently important to have a planetary boundary framing for our development in the future. Actually, yesterday, there was even an official plenary on prosperity within planetary boundaries, which was quite an accomplishment to get that into the frame of the entire World Economic Forum. And what you see on the screen here is a key reason for concern, because we're seeing for the first time observations of accelerated warming in the atmosphere to the left and in the ocean to the right. And this is happening despite the fact that we're actually leveling off the emission of greenhouse gases. So the Earth system is showing signs of losing resilience, and it is very likely related to the breaching of planetary boundaries, that we're seeing the first signs of lowered carbon uptake capacity on terrestrial ecosystems on land. We're seeing changes in aerosol loading. We're seeing changes in albedo. We're seeing changes in the freshwater cycle, which leads to more drying of ecosystems and forest fires. And these are all integrated Earth system feedbacks that are showing these indications, not that we've crossed a planetary tipping point, but that we need to respect multiple boundaries to have a chance of prosperity in the future. So 15 years of science has brought us to this figure you see on the screen here, quantifying a safe operating space for the 9 Earth system processes that have scientific evidence of regulating the stability, the resilience, and the life support on Earth. And as will come as no surprise for this audience, of course, it's not only climate, it is biosphere integrity, it's the land system configuration, it's the bloodstream of the whole Earth system, the hydrological cycle, it is the cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, the biogeochemical flows of what basically powers and nutrients in the system, it's aerosol loading, it's ocean stability, it's the stratospheric ozone layer, and finally, perhaps the most challenging one, novel entities. What you see here is the 2025 update of the science. 7 of the 9 boundaries are assessed to be breached. The yellow zone here is the uncertainty range in science. That is what I call the danger zone. you exit the safe space, which we set to keep the planet as close as possible to Holocene-like conditions. You enter the yellow zone and things can go wrong, but you're in the uncertainty range in science. You enter the red zone and you're likely to cause irreversible changes. Not that we crash the planet, but that we start really seeing feedbacks that can start moving, as I showed you in the first graph, where we start drifting off towards less and less livable conditions on Earth. Here you have, just since we published this in September, you have so much ample evidence showing increasing Earth energy imbalance on the upper left-hand corner. The last 3 years being breaching the planetary boundary on temperature. We've now exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius in a 3-year average. As you may know, Copernicus came up with data last week showing that very likely within the next 5 years, before 2030, we will be more permanently breaching 1.5. So we'll be entering overshoot. Tipping points are coming closer, and we continue to emit greenhouse gases. So we need the science guidance more than ever. Here is the reference point for the planetary boundaries, the Holocene. There are so many variants of this graph. This is a state of the climate update that we did together with Bill Ripple and colleagues very recently, showing and confirming again the extraordinary stability of the last 10,000 years. This is the 14 degrees Celsius, that's the 0 point, plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. That's when we've been able to develop civilizations as we know it. It's the reference point for the planetary boundaries. We use the Holocene as the corridor of life to be able to have as a reference to quantify safe boundaries. Then, of course, you have the hockey stick of where we are today and where we're heading. The corridor of life is defined there. The second piece of evidence for the planetary boundaries is, of course, the exponential rise of pressures, the Anthropocene. And that is what leads us to the conclusion today that we're inevitably heading into an overshoot mode. So all of the planetary boundary science is really about adaptation and building resilience and how to navigate ourselves back within a safe operating space. It's starting to hit us in terms of extreme events. So that's also something that may come up in the panel, that breaching boundaries leads to more extreme events, such as the Los Angeles fires and the Valencia floods, but it also leads to the risk of approaching tipping points. And the tipping points are mapped. So as part of the evidence to quantify boundaries, we support the tipping point science, which you see here, the 16 tipping point systems that we now understand regulates the stability of the climate system. And the boundaries are set to avoid crossing those tipping points. In Belém at COP30, we were forced for the first time to put out a science statement where we're warning that the two richest ecosystems on planet Earth, the Amazon rainforest and the coral reef systems in tropical regions, are very close to tipping points, not because of temperature alone, but because of breaching biodiversity boundary, hydrological boundary, nitrogen phosphorus eutrophication overloading, and loss of biodiversity. So this is what we did, bringing the planetary boundaries to COP30. It's the first time it happened, actually, a whole scientific pavilion on planetary boundaries. What you see here is a media huddle we had releasing this science statement. You see Professor Thelma Krug, Professor Carlos Nobre, Fatima Denton, so interdisciplinary scientists, which really represent the Frontiers Planet Prize, putting out this statement. This is the boundaries, the 9 boundaries, as I mentioned to you. The green surface area here is, this is a graph I presented at the plenary yesterday. This is where we started. This is Adam Smith in the whole Wealth of Nations. You know, there was an ample space for the planet. We had not reached any of the boundaries. And here we are today at a point where this economic paradigm has simply come to an end. In the Planetary Health Check, we do assess that we are outside of the safe space, but we're not yet in the red zone when you integrate all the 9 boundaries. So there's still room for transition, but the window is rapidly closing. The pathway to a safe future is well defined on climate, and then you have it here on phasing out fossil fuels, transforming the food system, scaling CDR. But look at the green and blue. We need to maintain the carbon uptake capacity on land, on green, and in the ocean in blue, which is all about coming back into safe planetary boundaries. And there we are. Sorry for making that a very quick overview, but I really want to invite our champions to give the science. But it's just, in summary, that the planetary boundary framework, I would argue, is today a mature guide for prosperity and equity for human development in the Anthropocene. We need nothing less when we define sustainable development today. Things must add up within the sustainable budgets for a safe and stable future for humanity. But it all has to come down to the local level, and it all has to come down to disciplines and applied research on the ground for solutions that can be scaled. And the champions here are scientists who are able to connect the scales, doing local research within specific disciplines, but also connecting it to what is implied at a system scale.
So my name is Mehrabi, and I run the Better Planet Laboratory. I'm here to speak about our award-winning research, which is really focused on food systems. And the reason we focus on food systems is because what we eat and how we produce that food is probably the single most important factor that's driving the transgression of these planetary boundaries you just heard about. So we're talking like a third of our, greenhouse gas emissions are linked to food systems. 90% of our water use is linked to food systems. Large amounts of eutrophication. It's the largest driver of biodiversity loss due to the large expanse, of agricultural land on the planet. And if you look, at our agricultural systems, and you see these negative impacts, you can't help but think there's something wrong. Right? There's something wrong with the way these systems are designed. And if you look at agricultural development policy over the last, 60, 70 years, it's really been focused on this idea of oversimplification, where we've designed our agricultural systems in ways which kind of they make assumptions that about ecosystems, that ecosystems are simple. And that's kind of helped us manage them. And it's been this package deal of seeds and fertilizers and mechanization, which has actually done a lot of good for humanity. We've grown a lot of food. We've stopped famine. We've grown a lot of calories. But it's had all these really negative environmental and social outcomes. And so as researchers, what we did is we got together to ask this question. What happens if you try and model agricultural systems a little bit more after nature? And in nature, what you see is you don't see one plant growing by itself. You don't see animals, by themselves. You see animals and plants interacting with each other in ecosystems. You see water cycling in those systems. You see temporal and spatial diversity. You see the teeming life in the soil. And you see complexity. And so we worked with thousands of farmers in every single continent in the world, excluding Antarctica, to embed these ideas in real farming systems and to assess what actually happens to these different outcomes that we care about. Environmental outcomes, such as externalities, environmental externalities and biodiversity loss, and social outcomes, such as food security, human well-being, the economics, and yield. And what we found was really, really interesting. We found that the dominant narrative that you would get a yield trade-off, a productivity loss when you do these kind of systems, wasn't present. So that's the first really important factor, right? The assumption that's driving the agricultural development policy that's leading to these negative outcomes we don't find evidence for that in these systems. And in fact, what we found is yield gains in some of these diversification systems, in fact. We also saw massive benefits for biodiversity and food security as well. And the really interesting thing about this is that what we found as well is the more that you do, the more that you try and model these systems after nature, the more different practices you integrate for the soil, for the animals, for the plants, for the non-crop biodiversity in these systems, you actually get these kind of non-additive effects. So they actually amplify the benefits of biodiversity, they amplify the benefits for food security. So that was really, really, really interesting for us. And there's a few other factors that made this work, important for the researchers, for the farmers that we're working with. And that was that we did this work on real farms, right? It's not done in scientific laboratories or in research stations. And often when you read about scientific studies, they're often done like in silico or on these research stations, and they show these large effects. The real challenge that we have in science and for translation of science is actually taking it into the real world. We see this in education, right? The real challenge of scaling up the innovation in education across different, And what our research, we found these effects in real farms, in real landscapes, And so that was really, really encouraging to us, assessing a lot of these different outcomes. We realise there's an important policy window for this. The UN Food System Summit, the first one was held a few years ago. One of the key things that industry was pushing, as well as academics and policymakers, was for diversification in agricultural systems. But they didn't really know how we're going to do it, but they realised this is an important fact. And we've started to develop the science now that shows a pathway to do that. And so that's really encouraging for us too. And the other thing, which I think is quite apt for the WEF, is that we did this work with obviously investment in research. And it just goes to show that if you invest in the research, it can actually yield really, really positive outcomes. And so we need more investment in this research to build a more sustainable future. And so I just want to end with one kind of observation, and that's that we've also done modelling looking into the future. So looking into 2100, what do we expect our agricultural landscapes to look like? And if you use the business as usual, and we continue on the current trajectory that we've been on, and we, into the future, what we're going to see is we're actually going to see a halving in the number of farms on the planet. And that's if you keep the agricultural area constant. The reason for this is economic development and mechanization and expansion and consolidation of farmland. So basically, the average size of the farm is going to double. It's going to double. And what we've seen over the past, and we have very strong empirical evidence for this, is when this happens, you see a lot of these negative outcomes that we've observed with the planetary boundaries happening. And so you lose diversity in those landscapes. So if you think that the damage that we see from agriculture and food systems is bad today, it's going to be, double as worse in another 75 years from now. That's the negative story. The positive story is that we actually have solutions that can lead to change. Even with these development trajectories, many of the interventions that we looked at were actually on larger farms as well. And so there's positive change that you can actually see in this development trajectory in re-envisioning our agricultural landscapes that function in a way that is more in harmony with nature. And there's a lot of positives that can bring for the planet and for people too. So I'll end there, but yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Johan. And just to complement Zia's point here, we quite recently released the second Eat Lancet Commission report on updating healthy diets for sustainable food systems. Number one, confirming that the food system transition is the most impactful, is the one transformation with the largest potential of bringing us back within the safe operating space boundaries because of the multiple impacts. The largest consumer of fresh water is the food system, nitrogen phosphorus overloading, land system change, biodiversity loss, and the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So we're talking of a huge potential here. And your point about the trajectory we're following in the consolidation of farms, I think, is fundamental here. But so this is one of the big transitions that we need to focus much more attention to. How is it? Do we have Arunima's? Yeah, wonderful. So over to you then, Arunima. You even have the clicker. Super.
Okay, so I'll go through the research that we submitted for the prize. The work that we do at the University of Sydney is on supply chains. So global supply chains, as we know, are complex, they're interconnected. They, of course, are everywhere that we see and the world that we live in. So the food that we consume, we produce, the travel that we do, the buildings that we live and work in, or the energy that we consume and also the energy that gets produced, they're all part of interconnected supply chain networks. Of course, these global and interconnected supply chains, they embody a range of impacts, and that is what our research is about. And these impacts are positive as well as negative. So positive impacts in the form of jobs and income creation across the world for people, but negative impacts in the form of biodiversity threats, air pollution, land degradation, water scarcity, and so on. So in terms of quantifying these impacts, which much of my research is about, the approach that we use starts off with tracking down what exactly are the consumption needs or the consumption demand. So starting with the consumer and then figuring out what are the immediate needs of the consumer, or consumer can be anyone, you and I in the room, businesses, regions, countries. We have modeling capabilities in our group which allow us to track these impacts at different scales and different resolutions. So The way this happens in terms of modeling is starting with the consumption, figuring out what the needs are, who are the immediate suppliers, suppliers of suppliers, suppliers of suppliers. It keeps expanding in an upstream supply chain tree. It never sort of ends because our supply chains are interconnected and they're billions. So where do you stop? The methodology that we use at the University of Sydney and was part of the research that won the prize features multi-regional input-output databases, which captures these infinite supply chains to allow us to figure out where the hotspots are. So when I say hotspots, these are environmental or social impacts. They could be greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, water use, biodiversity threats. So if we're consuming coffee, for example, we have coffee in the room, but I'm not pointing at anyone. What are the impacts in terms of which specific species gets impacted from specific consumption patterns? That's what we try and unravel from our modeling capabilities. So in terms of the paper that we submitted for the prize, at the University of Sydney, along with many institutions which we collaborated with, we developed 12 consumption-based proxies, which we linked to 12 specific Sustainable Development Goals. And these 12 specific proxies also had links to planetary boundaries. So many of the planetary boundaries that are relevant to the prize, to the paper that we submitted: climate change, biosphere integrity, land systems change, freshwater change, biogeochemical flows, and atmospheric aerosol loading. These consumption-based proxies are linked to specific SDGs. So for example, we have SDG 13, climate action, and we had a proxy where we had data for 164 countries, more than 20,000 global sectors for all 164 regions for greenhouse gas emissions, and accordingly for all other proxies that are on the slide. So the key finding of the study really was, at a global scale, for many of the indicators, we are experiencing polarizing impacts. So what exactly do I mean by polarizing impacts? So these are impacts that take place because of consumption demands in a specific country that negatively impacts its trading partners. So, of course, producers and consumers, they're not all residing in one location. We're very much interconnected, but also very much distant in where we live and produce and consume goods and services. So there are polarizing impacts that happen because of global supply chains. There are also positive impacts. So some equalizing trends and some polarizing trends that were observed in the study and the modeling that we did. Now, these were high-level results, but of course we can break this down at a country level. And this is why I wanted slides, because it's easier to show what these results are. So we categorized countries as either net importers, net exporters, export trending, import trending over a roughly 29-year period to understand over time what is the global situation like for different indicators. What are the dynamics between different countries and different indicators. So if I just zoom in, of course we looked at 12 SDGs, and the paper talks in great detail about each one of them. But if we just zoom into one, which is SDG 13, climate action, and look at the trends for net exporters and export trending countries and net importers and import trending countries, we can see that the production-based impacts, which is P on the graph, and C are consumption-based impacts. The production-based impacts for net exporters, export trending countries are much higher than consumption-based impacts, and it's quite the opposite for countries that sit in the other quadrant, which is the import trending and net importers. So of course, that really shows the dynamic in terms of international trade, how countries are producing, consuming, where exactly are impacts taking place, and who are the other consumers. In collaboration with the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, of course, with the models that we have, we've applied these to unravel impacts at production layers. So I started off with a consumption diagram where I had links at different layers of production. So production layers broken down and impacts to see for each region where exactly are products coming from and where exactly are the impacts. So really figuring out impacts in the supply chain. Now, you can't manage what you don't measure. So since winning the prize, we have started off a Scope 3 emissions masterclass to support businesses in quantifying their Scope 3 impacts. So there is need to understand where exactly are these impacts in supply chains to have more transparency. And businesses, they need support in terms of tools and methodologies so they can apply to find out where their impacts are. So at Sydney Uni, we've run 2 sessions for this masterclass, which is a 2-hour class. It's a skill-based for business leaders and business professionals who can join, and we teach them step-by-step how to do Scope 3 supply chain assessments. We've also launched a sustainable business hub at the University of Sydney. It has 70 members, all academics with strong links with industry, with the aim of producing solutions for transformative change, for figuring out what we can employ and what techniques we can use for net zero positive transitions. And I'll just finish up with this last slide to say the research that we published and the work that we are advancing in collaborating with businesses, it really goes to show that we need to broaden the indicator framework for measuring impacts, looking at consumption patterns as well, measuring spillover effects, and of course that all feeds into having just policies. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Arunima. And there's a lot here that connects to the debates at the World Economic Forum, not least on how we measure carbon flows. And we might come back to that if we have some time. But there is a discussion, as you may know, now on how to deal with Scope 3 in the reporting. And Carbon Measure is one initiative from essentially private sector initiated to try and get rid of Scope 3 reporting because it's so challenging, particularly for the oil, gas, and coal dependent industries to be responsible for the consumption of their emissions that they're producing. And therefore I think this science is so important to also be a counterforce to that effort, because we should stay with the Science-Based Target Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which includes Scope 1 and 2 and 3 and continues to really emphasize the need for the responsibility across the entire value chain. So I mean, it's again another example, just like Zia, of science that is immediately relevant for policy and action. Zara, over to you.
I always start my presentation showing New York. This is New York in 1920s. And this is the highway. Actually, it was an engineering solution for an urban problem by that time. And after a decade, this massive infrastructure got abandoned. So what happened? Something remarkable. We can see that actually birds, plants, pollinator, they started to move into the city, to this abandoned area, without asking our permission. So city didn't ask for this type of, green areas. But nature started to do what it does best, yeah? Cooling, healing, improving the surrounding areas for us. And people started to look at this infrastructure or this abandoned area differently. It was a place for people, for city planners, for people that are living there to look at this space completely differently. It was a space for them to be able to work with nature. So imagine now sitting or walking in a street that was once overheated, noisy, and now is cooled, yeah? It's very pleasant with these rows of trees and thriving nature that was surrounded here. And this is actually what we meant by nature-based solution. This is the shift in our mind, how we can work with nature, how we can use nature to make our cities more attractive, more livable, and more climate resilience. So we know that cities worldwide, actually they are embracing these solutions. They're trying to use these solutions in their planning. But there is still the lack and guidance for them that how and where they should apply these solutions, to work with nature, to have the most impact of these solutions to be able to mitigate the source of the climate, which is greenhouse gas emissions. So we put the main question there. How can cities use nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change? So this main question led us to 3 fundamental questions that I have put it here. Which type of nature-based solutions strategy are most effective in reducing the urban greenhouse gas emissions? Because we have plenty of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is umbrella of the type of the green infrastructure that we are already using actually in our cities. So the second question was about the potential. What type of the potential, or how much this solution, how can we calculate actually their contribution to achieving carbon neutrality in European cities? And the third question was that where we need to put them. Of course, when it comes to, for example, implementation, maybe me as a city or planner would decide or choose a place that is easiest way for me to implement. But the science says that no, if you put it in this place, actually, you would have the most impact of using these solutions to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So where was one of the most important question for us? If you are planning, where we need to put it on the landscape, because we are working on the whole landscape. Yeah? So what we learned actually was that nature-based solutions can deliver real city-scale climate mitigation if they are strategically planned. And I really emphasize strategically here. So these are some of the answers that we got it from our article, that if these solutions they are fully implemented, actually they can reduce the carbon emissions up to 25%. And I would say that we developed a model and we actually implement or use this model on 54 cities across Europe. And what we could see that actually, and I think this is very important, it's not just about the direct impact that we get it from these solutions, about capturing the carbon. It's about indirect impact, which is also very important. How this solution can have the impact on the choice that we are making. For example, if you want to go to work, yeah? This indirect impact in terms of our social behavior, our choices, that is very important as well. At the same time, it's very important as well in terms of the source of energy that we are saving. So actually, we could also see from the result that if these solutions, because these solutions stand alone, cannot help to achieve the carbon neutrality. We need to combine them with other strategies going on. So if we combine these, these strategies and these solutions with other strategies, then we can achieve actually around 63% reduction in our emissions. So we were asked that what is coming next? Now we have got this prize, which is fantastic. Thanks to Frontier Planet Prize and thanks to you, Johan, for a massive, work that you guys did it, and you made us, to be able to give us this credibility, this visibility. So what we are doing next, actually, is to contact, in my case, to get the contact with different cities, to be able to talk about our research, to be able, what I'm doing now, to integrate an AI-based decision support system with a special nature-based solutions models. So this will help us actually to unify the system to be able to evaluate multiple mitigation pathways together. So what we are doing next, or what we are actually trying to do now, is to co-design directly with cities, which means that actually we want to ensure tools that they can use it, they can understand it, and they can use it on the daily work, daily basis work. And what we are also trying to do to help the cities to identify the gaps that they have in data, and in the governance and capacity. So we want to go from access readiness before implementation, and this is what they are. Because implementation, it means that they need lots of funding, money to be able to do it, and before implementation, we want to make sure that actually we are access ready to do it. So, and what is else that is good with nature-based solutions is the multifunctionality. So, of course, in that paper, we focus on the carbon, but nature-based solution can become like one of the solutions for climate adaptation as well. I mean, Johan, you were talking about the extreme events, yeah? And so how we can use or optimize nature-based solutions for adaptation, co-benefits, floods, heat, drought, and improving biodiversity, which is very, very important as well. And this is, I mean, directly connected to the planetary boundaries as well. And so we want to use the real-time scenario testing to be able to use the climate and socioeconomic data. And this will help us to create digital twins for cities. And actually, we have started. And thanks to the prize that I got it, actually, I have got another funding from Sweden that we are going to create a digital twin for Stockholm now. So, and beyond the Stockholm, Sweden, and all the cities, we want to scale globally. This is our goal, to be able to enable cities worldwide, not just European, not just Nordic country, worldwide to plan for better mitigation and adaptation, hopefully together. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah, and I'm sure some of you in the room immediately connect with this research in terms of also, you can just imagine the co-benefits with human health. When we learned during the pandemic how important it is to have shade and livable space, green spaces in urban areas. So this has an enormous potential. And these are three examples, you know, supply chain sustainability, the whole food system transition, and the livable cities as parts of the transformation back within a safe operating space for a prosperous and equitable future for humanity. And I see this really to be the game changer on how we define sustainable development and how we also increasingly translate the science into human benefits. And that's the language of WEF. The only language understood on the promenade here is really economic profitability, it is resilience, it is human well-being, it is the welfare. And I think that comes across so nicely in what this whole endeavor has accomplished. Thanks a lot, and unfortunately we've run out of time. Just three kind of carry home messages in my mind. I mean, number one, I really hope that you exited this session feeling convinced that we need help of spreading the message that we need, to quote you, Zia, we need science to guide action on the transformation towards a sustainable future, which is the basis for prosperity and equity. Secondly, we've come to a point where everything we do needs to add up at the planetary scale. There's no escaping it. And that is also a vehicle for success, for a viable future for humanity. And the third is I really want to thank the Frontiers Foundation. This is really an initiative, it's a brave initiative to put up the world's largest prize in support of science for us to have a chance of navigating our future on planet Earth. And this is the first time it happens here in Davos, but I understand the foundation is really in for the long term. So do spread the message and encourage colleagues, institutions, academics that this is truly the world championship in science for our future on planet Earth. Let's win the game. Thanks.